Going to start our hearing. Some of you have testified before or been around our testimony, so you have a pretty good handle of how it works. I'll have an opening statement, and Mr. Sarbanes will have statements that should go about 10 minutes per side, and then we're going to go right into your testimony, and we'll go from Mr. Overton to my right. So, let's start the clock. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us on our second in a series of horse-related hearings. And as I mentioned last week, I have very fond memories of working at the racetrack in Omaha, Nebraska. And even when I was finished working there, it was I just couldn't get away from it. There's just such a romance with those thoroughbreds. And I loved standing on the rail of the stretch, and as they come around that corner, and you can just feel the ground shaking from their power, and just majestic animals. So I have a real love for our race horsing industry and those horses. And so that's why we're here today, is to talk about the future of thoroughbred horse racing and how the horses have been treated and some of the allegations that have been made through what I would say community-based organizations, but also legitimate news organizations. So the perception is that the doping or drug use for the horses has become pervasive. In fact, in a poll done by Jockey Club that has been quoted many times by my colleagues, and this is the major handicappers and bettors will actually take into account which barns, trainers have a reputation for using masking drugs and eliminate them from their handicapping, and maybe even some tracks that have a reputation versus other tracks for how tough they are in enforcing the no drugs policy. Now, these types of unsavory practices bring two major concerns to the forefront. Number one is the safety of the jockeys. And there's been one study that showed that 24 horses a week have some incident on the track while they're racing. While the animal itself we should care for, the most important is the human being on top of that. It is a dangerous sport. We know when a horse is racing, and it should not be due to injury that both the animal and the human being, that is, are exposed to those dangers. And I'm deeply concerned about the implications to the fairness of horse racing and the pervasive or perceived pervasive use of PEDs may have. In 1978, when Congress passed the Interstate Horseracing Act, one of the issues Congress sought to address was a responsible atmosphere for off-track betting so that people could place wagers on horses with a degree of certainty that this was a regulated affair. To put it bluntly, if PEDs are being used, that's cheating. And you're cheating the bettors to the point where the big handicappers won't bet on races where they think horses may have been doped. So it's not acceptable, and I compliment Joe Pitts and Jan Schakowsky for this legislation. And at this time, I have a minute 16 to yield to somebody. Lance?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to our distinguished panel and everyone in the audience. The thoroughbred industry has had a significant cultural and economic impact here in the United States. The industry supports over 1 million permanent jobs and has had an estimated economic impact of over $100 billion. Beyond that, the thoroughbred industry is a part of American culture. Millions attend and watch events such as the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness Stakes each year, and thousands attend local races in their home communities. In New Jersey, races at the Meadowlands and at Monmouth Park generate significant local interest and economic impact. However, in recent years, the thoroughbred industry has been plagued by the usage of performance-enhancing drugs. This practice not only delegitimizes the sport, but also endangers both the horses that participate in these contests and the jockeys who are at risk of serious paralysis or death should a horse suffer an injury. Doping in the thoroughbred industry is a concern for every industry stakeholder, from the small-time bettor who has had to take into account who is doping when handicapping choices, to the owners who want to preserve the credibility of their industry. I look forward to examining this legislation and hearing testimony from our diverse and distinguished panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And now the acting ranking member, Mr. Sarbanes, you are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take the full 5 minutes. Appreciate you convening this hearing so we can examine this important topic and the proposed legislation to address this issue of the use of performance-enhancing drugs in the horse racing industry. As has been mentioned by the other members so far, this is a very important industry to the country, generating almost 150,000 jobs. It's a $10.6 billion industry nationally. Horse racing is important in my state. My district is right across the street, the boundary of it, right across the street from the Pimlico racetrack where the Preakness is held. I mention that only because everybody who goes to the race parks in the neighborhood of my constituents.
You get a charge $5 to park in front of your house?
Yeah, they charge more than that, actually, and for people to park on their front lawns. In addition, the 3rd District of Maryland is home to one of the largest memberships of the Humane Society in the country, so I'm very focused as well on the welfare of the horses. So this is an important topic of discussion. You do these things, you examine these things, you make sure that a sport like this is clean because it's in the long-term interests of the industry and maintaining the vibrancy of the industry in the eyes of the public and those who participate. So it's an important hearing. I know we're trying to move quickly to the witnesses. I'm prepared to yield time to any other members here if they would take it. Otherwise, I'd be prepared to yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts, you are recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition, for the privilege to join the important hearing today on H.R. 2012. I'd like to augment my statement today by showing a short video clip which sets the tone for why the Congress must act to protect jockeys, horses, and the public from the scourge of drugs in horse racing. Try to get sound.
At California racetracks that died. You know, that's very, very difficult to justify.
Why do racehorses break down at such high rates? Many point to a growing reliance on drugs. Some trainers experiment with illegal concoctions, cancer drugs, Viagra, even cobra venom. The penalties are hardly a deterrent.
We think that the rules and penalties in racing still fall far short of the strictness that's required to deter some of the problems we see.
Legal drugs may be even riskier. If a horse is pumped full of pain medication, the track vet may not be able to diagnose an injury before it races. And a horse running through a masked injury can lead to catastrophic consequences.
We need to get away from medicating horses for pain and allowing them to run with a rider on their back and a stick in his hand. That it just doesn't smell right.
But racing has become a numbers game like never before. Some trainers will do whatever it takes to get their least expensive horses on the track as often as possible. At casino racetracks, also known as racinos, purse money can be 3 times the value of the horse.
Casinos have done nothing other than infuse money. Many of them don't really care that much about racing.
Horse racing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. 365 days a year, thoroughbreds compete in the grandeur of the Kentucky bluegrass and in bull rings behind casinos. And all too often, the horses are run right into the ground.
Please see on the TV screen a display of one horse, Coronado Heights, 4-year-old thoroughbred that received a diagnosis of early degenerative joint disease but was raced anyway, broke down, was euthanized on the track. And at your seat, you can see what was administered to him 1 week before he broke down. 17 syringes. So despite promises and assurances, state and industry groups have been able to come together to develop uniform rules. The fact remains that there's no single entity which has the authority to impose uniform rules on racing commissions, tracks, trainers, and owners. So I urge members to consider H.R. 2012, a sound national framework to protect horses, riders, and the public. I look forward to hearing the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Florida, do you wish to make a statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for holding this very important hearing. First, I want to echo the views that no one wants to see animals mistreated or harmed in any way. No horse should be intentionally neglected, mistreated, or subjected to unnecessary trauma. Additionally, those that participate in interstate parimutuel activities should be assured that they are participating on a fair and transparent level that protects the integrity of the sport. I do, however, wish to closely examine the most appropriate manners in which to ensure this. As a general guiding principle, all manners of compliance, assistance, and incentives with states and industry should be exhausted before further empowering agencies. This committee should applaud the growing efforts to adopt uniform national reforms on the state level. Tampa Bay Downs, one of the country's oldest racetracks and the only thoroughbred racetrack on the west coast of Florida, is located in my congressional district. And it also supports this approach and is one of the more than 50 racetracks across the country to endorse these reforms. Additionally, the Florida Division of Parimutuel Wagering is hosting a workshop tomorrow to receive public input on its rules regarding drugs and veterinarian procedures and enforcement. Thank you again, Mr. Terry, and I look forward to the
Thank
hearing.
you.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute. Does the Vice Chair of the full committee wish an opening statement?
I would just simply welcome all of our witnesses. We're delighted that you're here, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, and that concludes all of the opening statements done. Do you have? Yes.
Just to take
you
a
were
minute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I grew up in horse racing. My father had race horses. It's still one of my favorite sports, but I grew up in a time when these kinds of issues with drugging horses didn't happen, and I'm just glad that we're having this hearing today. And I thank the witnesses and welcome them.
Thank you very much. Now that concludes our opening statements. Fun fact before we introduce our guests, our witnesses, that chariot racing was the first Olympic sport in 1680 BC. Horse racing's been around a long time, and we want to keep it that way. The witnesses, Henry, do you want to make a statement? Okay. Want to introduce all of our witnesses. As I mentioned, we'll start with Mr. Overton, who is Chairman Skylearn LLC and former Chairman of the Minnesota Racing Commission. Phil Hanrahan, Chief Executive Officer, National Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association. Dr. Lawrence Soma, VMD, Professor Emeritus of Anesthesia and Clinical Pharmacology at University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. Good thing it wasn't Penn State. We play them Saturday. I would have had to grill you much more. Travis Tygart, CEO, U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. Dr. Sheila Lyons, DMV, founder and director of American College of Veterinary Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation. And Wayne Pacelli, Chief Executive Officer and President, Humane Society of the United States. Thank you all for taking your time to share your wisdom with us today. Mr. Overton, you will have 5 minutes. Each of yes.
Before he starts, I just want to welcome all the witnesses. I do have a statement I want to put in the record in support of the effort to stop the inhumane practices relating to horses.
Without objection. So each of you will have 5 minutes. There's little sign up here you can glance up to. The 1 minute mark will be a yellow slash, and that means start wrapping it up. 5 minutes-ish, I'll start tapping the gavel to let you know to wrap it up. Mr. Overton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Mr. Sarbanes, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts and experiences regarding the painful truth about drugging of racehorses, the current challenges with medication rules, and the need for H.R. 2012 to reform drug use in U.S. racing. I was appointed by Governor Tim Plenty to a 5.5-year term on the Minnesota Racing Commission, with the last 2.5 years of my service during the tenure of Governor Mark Dayton. While I no longer serve in an official capacity, my experiences serving on the Racing Commission makes me a strong supporter of H.R. 2012. Minnesota, like every racing jurisdiction in North America, is faced with multiple challenges, not least of which is the establishment and enforcement of uniform regulations in racing. Specifically, it was my role as a racing commissioner to work toward a reduction in the number of medication violations through better testing and serious enforcement protocols. During my tenure, the commission established stricter medication rules and employed a modern drug testing lab. Trainers and owners frequently race their horses in multiple states, so keeping up with various drug requirements and withdrawal times is a daunting task. And with winning as an overarching goal, some trainers race in states with more lenient medication rules. In fact, Minnesota's stricter medication and enforcement rules resulted in some horsemen electing not to return to Minnesota when we improved our medication testing. It is my strong belief that if integrity is not the fundamental underpinning of horse racing as both a sport and a gaming operation, it is destined to failure. Horse racing involves the government, gaming operators, racetrack owners, and horsemen. Racehorse owners and veterinarians are supporting players. In my experience, some of the industry's groups challenge the integrity of the sport. They will say there are few or no problems either with the use of drugs or with the enforcement against those who do not comply with the regulation. This is simply not true. There is an inherent problem with a model consisting of 38 separate regulatory entities and many industry interest groups all believing that they are in charge. The fact is there is little coordination among racing commissions, industry groups at the state and interstate level. And with so many cooks in the kitchen, there is confusion, conflict, and chaos in medication regulations. This is a perfect environment for those who can't keep up with the rules or those who choose to improperly or illegally medicate horses to take advantage of the disorganization. As a racing commissioner, I was stunned by the lengths some trainers will go to win races. As you will hear from other witnesses, there is no drug or compound that has not been tried in horses, from EPO, anabolical steroids, to frog juice and cobra venom. And I promise there are chemists right now working up new, illegal, undetectable substances to give a trainer who wants a performance advantage, especially if he or she does not have the fastest horse. Unless drug testing is conducted uniformly and in the state-of-art laboratories, unscrupulous horsemen will continue to cheat the system, the horses, and the fans. I have attended many meetings of racing consortia and regulatory to find a common regulatory paradigm within which all racing jurisdictions must comply. But as long as there are 38 separate jurisdictions, this goal is impossible to attain despite decades of sincere people's best efforts. While multiple states have adopted racing compacts to align medication requirements, the fact is the enforcement of these compacts will vary from state to state, as no single entity has authority to enforce in more than one state. The approaches vary, the outcome is the same. Unlike other professional sports like football, baseball, there is a central authority. No consistency in lab capabilities, no uniform penalties, no dedicated funding to increase lab testing, nor conduct research to catch the next magic potion illegally administered to horses. H.R. 2012 and the new authority will provide, through the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, would establish a single drug testing body by virtue of a strong and consistent enforcement regulation. Through the enactment of H.R. 2012, all racing commissions would work in cooperation with USADA to strengthen and clean the competition policies and provide uniform medication testing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Overton. Mr. Hanrahan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm the CEO of the National Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association. The NHBPA is the largest organization in the United States representing owners and trainers in thoroughbred horse racing. We have approximately 29,000 members in the United States and Canada. Let me start by stating unequivocally the NHBPA's position on medication. Owners and trainers who cheat by administering drugs that have no legitimate use in horses in an attempt to influence the outcome of a race should, after due process, be kicked out of horse racing. The use of dimorphin is doping, plain and simple. So too is blood doping, gene doping, and other narcotics. However, let me quickly add, data compiled by state racing authorities shows conclusively that doping of thoroughbred horses in the United States is extremely rare. In the United States, 2 horses are tested every race. During the 4-year period from 2009 through 2012, there were more than 360,000 post-race tests of blood and urine. Only 142 tests, I say again, 142 tests, were positive for doping substances. More than 99.9% of all tests showed no doping substances were present. The NHBPA, however, draws a clear distinction between illegal doping and lawful therapeutic medication administered by licensed veterinarians. The HBPA supports the continued use of Lasix and other therapeutic medications because they are necessary for the health and welfare of horses and reduce the risk of injury to jockeys. Now, turning to H.R. 2012, the NHBPA opposes its enactment because it attempts to address a problem that does not exist and purports to do so by employing USADA, which has neither the experience in horse racing nor the resources to regulate medication in the horse racing industry. Medication rules and machinery for their enforcement already exist in every racing state. News reports claim rampant use of illegal drugs that state regulators are ignoring. A look at the state regulatory data shows such claims are not true. Data for the most recent 4-year period shows more than 99.9% of the hundreds of thousands of post-race tests were negative for doping. Likewise, more than 99.2% of tests were negative for therapeutic medication remaining in a horse on race day. Despite this objective evidence demonstrating there is no widespread misuse in medication in thoroughbred racing, some industry voices have called for a ban on all medication. Those who do so labor under the erroneous belief that race day medication is routinely permitted and that it causes injuries to horses. That's not true. The only race day medication allowed in the U.S., with minor exception, is Lasix. Unfortunately, Lasix, which H.R. 2012 bans, has become the poster child for those arguing in favor of a ban on all medication and has obscured scientific and medical facts about Lasix, including the following. Running hard causes nearly all horses to bleed in their lungs and can cause instant death on the racetrack. One of my co-panelists, Dr. Larry Summer, published research documenting the racetrack deaths of horses due to bleeding in the lungs. Lasix prevents and lessens bleeding and is the only medication that does so. Lasix is not performance enhancing. It does not make a horse run faster than its God-given natural talent. A landmark 2009 study in South Africa of 167 thoroughbred horses in racetrack conditions conclusively proved the effectiveness of Lasix in preventing and lessening the severity of bleeding. It's wrong to claim without any empirical evidence that fatalities are caused by permissive drug use. Last year's New York report on racehorse health and safety noted breakdowns at Aqueduct occurred for a multitude of reasons having little to do with medication. While the NHBPA opposes H.R. 2012, we do recognize the utility of uniform medication rules. Medication use, post-race testing thresholds, and penalties often vary from state to state. For that reason, the NHBPA is continuing to work with the Association of Racing Commissioners International on drafting uniform model rules. 9 states in the Mid-Atlantic have taken the lead and approved uniform medication rules. 11 others are currently considering adopting those rules. We have high regard for USADA's efforts in policing illegal drug use in human sports competition, but the organization has no experience in equine veterinary science or the horse industry. In short, H.R. 2012 is not needed. The job is already being done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Soma, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I would like to review the progress that has been made in improving equine drug testing and some changes in the curtailment of the use of certain drugs. Prior to 2008, only 5 of the 18 U.S. racing laboratories were accredited to international standards, which are referred to as ISO 17025. As of June 13th, 10 of the 16 laboratories are accredited. Laboratories that are accredited to these standards meet technical and quality management requirements. The standards require the laboratory to implement a quality assurance system aimed at demonstrating the ability to consistently produce valid test results, starting from proper handling of incoming samples to reproducibility and accuracy of analytical results. This is not a one-shot deal. Laboratories have to be reaccredited, and the on-site assessment of a laboratory is mandatory every 2 years. So an inspector comes in, goes through the laboratory, and assesses their quality assurance capabilities. A committee appointed by the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium was charged with developing a second accreditation program for the equine industry. This committee, which I was a member, developed the laboratory accreditation requirements and operating standards. The requirements for this level of accreditations are extensive and are guided by the requirements outlined by the U.S. Doping Agency laboratories. The committee basically started with this handbook and developed guidelines which can be used in the industry. The laboratory must participate in an external quality assurance program which requires analysis of proficiency samples. The laboratory must successfully identify and confirm and quantify the drug in blood and urine. The laboratory knows that the samples are coming, but do not know what drug is in the blood or urine sample. The above requirements are important aspects of the program that determines if a laboratory has the capability, personnel, and instrumentation required to detect substance of concern at the concentrations that are mandated by the industry. The stated goal of this program is to ensure that all laboratories are operating at the same standard. The first type of accreditation indicates how well the laboratory is functioning, their data management. The second state tells you how the performance of that is. Can you find certain drugs, and can they be confirmed in a reasonable time frame? National guidelines have also been published for the withdrawal times for 24 commonly used therapeutic drugs. This allows for the treatment of horses during training if they are properly used. For example, progress has been made on the drug control front. Anabolic steroids have been banned from use in North America, and the injections of drugs into the equine joint has been regulated. As a result of these regulations, injection of of drugs into the joint are really cannot be done for up to before 7 days. The horse has to be medicated before 7 days before they allow the horse to run. There are still a number of drugs which are problematic. One of the problems is certainly that Lasix is still allowed in the state, in the United States and Canada. Number two, there are many drugs out there which are difficult to find, and there's very, very little research in trying to attempt to find these drugs. Fortunately, the state of Pennsylvania does provide research funds to our laboratory to look at peptides, EPO type of drugs, and drugs which are very, very difficult to find on the current establishment laboratory. Even if you have if you have a very good laboratory that can find hundreds of drugs in a certain, in one screening, there are still drugs out there which we have not developed method for. And these are protein-based drugs. These are small peptides like the morphine. These are small peptides. These drugs are difficult to find. And I'm sure there are many more coming along which the laboratories really need resources to improve their research capabilities. But many laboratories have improved. Some laboratories have left because they could not meet these requirements. So as far as testing is concerned, I think there's been a great change over the last 5 years in improving this aspect of racing. Rules and regulation throughout the states is still a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Tiger, you are recognized, and as I understand, you just flew back from South Africa, so if you're talking a little slower because of your jet lag, we'll understand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Travis Tiger, and I'm the CEO at the United States Anti-Doping Agency. It's an honor for me to be here representing the USADA board and the tens of millions of clean athletes that we serve. It's also an honor for USADA, a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation based in Colorado, to play a role as an independent organization to assist the sport of horse racing, to ensure a level playing field, enhance the consumer confidence in the gaming industry, and to sustain a culture of health for athletes, and hopefully allow for the overall economic growth for the entire horse industry, as we've seen in the Olympic movement. True sport is built on the idea of honesty, respect, fairness, and an equal opportunity for success under the rule of law, the very same principles that build the foundation of every free and democratic society. We firmly believe, as do our athletes, that the greatest injustice in sport is when one competitor robs another of their hard work, dedication, and victory because they gained an unfair advantage contrary to the rules. Accordingly, we welcome and appreciate this committee's focus on the harms that are caused by performance-enhancing drug use in sport. The issue of drugs in sport and corruption in sport strikes at the very heart of what role sport will play in America's future. Bottom line, if we turn a blind eye to fraudulent conduct, contrary to the rules of competition, in track and field, cycling, football, even horse racing, essentially saying as long as we win and don't get caught, it's okay, then we send a very powerful message that it's acceptable, justifiable, even noble to win by any means necessary, including dangerous performance-enhancing drugs, fraud, or whatever, as long as you win and you don't get caught. And make no mistake, the win-at-all-cost culture is alive and well and will flourish in every sport, including horse racing, if we do not take decisive action to stop the thieves from running wild and instead truly give hope to those who compete to win under the rules. USADA's perspective on the current anti-doping climate in horse racing comes from living the history of the fight against doping that has occurred within the International Olympic movement over the past 13 years. In the late 1990s, there was a myriad of different anti-doping rules and regulations across the globe in each jurisdiction in sport. There was no uniform or harmonized policy for what was considered a violation, what was tested for, how collections and chain of custodies procedures applied, what laboratory standards applied. There were varying sanction links. Ultimately, this system of self-regulation by the various states and sports created an untenable position for sport, for athletes, and it seriously disrupted the economic viability of the Olympic Games. Suffice it to say, the Olympic rings were badly tarnished, and that was bad for business. In 1999, athletes, governments, sporting world said enough is enough and came together to solve the problem. This game-changing moment ultimately led to the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, and after an open, transparent consultation process, eventually led to the passage of the WADA Code and the international standards. Today, the code and the standards are the uniform policies that apply equally to all athletes, coaches, and trainers across the globe. They are the substantive anti-doping rules that we all agree to and we are bound by. To date, there are approximately 520 sport organizations and 172 governments from around the world that have accepted and agreed to abide by the WADA Code. There's no good reason why this same effort cannot be done for the horse racing industry in the United States, and the current legislation allows for it. The first step to curing the problem was passing the uniform policy. The second, equally important measure was to ensure the uniform and full implementation of the policy. USADA was opened in late 2000 as the organization that handles this responsibility. It was extremely courageous for the United States Olympic Committee, the 45 or so national federations like USA Basketball, USA Swimming, to fully externalize their efforts to USADA. But they took the stand because it was clear the sports themselves could not simultaneously promote and police themselves. In addition to true independence and transparency, the WADA Code provides a guide to what this legislation would allow to be addressed effectively in the horse racing industry. Effective testing, including standardized selection, collection, chain of custody, and transport rules and practices. A full list of substances and methods that would capture new designer drugs, as you just heard from Dr. Soma. Implementation of best legal practices and policies, which must include adequate sanctions to deter doping and due process protections for those accused of violations. Implementation of best scientific standards for laboratory uniformity and practices, including a robust accreditation and proficiency testing program, as well as scientific research for the detection of new substances. Investigative units and partnerships with government, particularly law enforcement, to ensure those who illegally manufacture, traffic, and distribute these dangerous drugs who might be outside of sports jurisdiction are also held accountable. In conclusion, I'd like to thank this committee for its time, its interest on this important ethical and public health issue, and for inviting me here today to share USADA's experiences. We look forward to assisting you in any way possible going forward as you consider this legislation and hopefully restore the faith in this wonderful sport.
Thank you, and thank you for your extraordinary efforts to be here today. Dr. Lyons, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Terry, Ranking Member Sarbanes, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to testify today. My name is Sheila Lyons, and I'm a veterinarian who specializes in equine sports medicine and physical medicine and rehabilitation. My private veterinary consulting practice is both national and international in scope, which provides me with an overview of the horse racing industry and the veterinary profession that includes many distinct jurisdictions. I am the founder of the American College of Veterinary Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation, a member of the International Society of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and a member of the International Federation of Sports Medicine. I provide education to veterinary students, veterinarians, physical therapists, farriers, and horsemen across the country and internationally. My patients have included some of the world's finest thoroughbred racehorses, but I have regularly provided veterinary services to horses at every level of this sport for nearly 30 years. First, do no harm. This well-known creed describes the most important and fundamental principle of medical ethics. It is also the principle that is being violated every day by racetrack veterinarians across this country. First, get this horse to the races has become the substitute creed for too many racetrack veterinarians. The pervasive and unethical use of injury masking and performance-enhancing drugs in horse racing in the United States has created a national health and safety crisis in the industry and is destroying the reputation of a once vibrant sport. This pattern of drug abuse is deemed legal, and some might say encouraged under our current horse racing regulatory system. The Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act of 2013 holds the power to reverse this injustice through its mandate of drug-free racing, its designation of a national and fully independent expert regulatory authority, its requirement that appropriate penalties be enforced without bias, and this legislation's clear and unambiguous message to the horse racing industry, veterinary community, and the public that cheaters will not prosper and drugs may only be administered under the strict ethical and professional guidelines known as the veterinarian client-patient relationship. The veterinarian's role will once again be based upon the principles of veterinary medical ethics. The veterinarian client-patient relationship seems a simple term, but holds powerful meaning. This legislation's repeated incorporation of this term in this bill is key to enacting essential reform in the standard of veterinary care that all racehorses receive without regard to their monetary value or level of racing. Not unlike the standards governing human medicine, the standards of veterinary practice, which all licenses are conditioned upon, include a fundamental basis for all services called the veterinarian client-patient relationship. This requires that a veterinarian have adequate knowledge of a patient before administering or prescribing drugs for the animal. Such adequate knowledge requires the veterinarian to take a full patient history, conduct an examination, make a diagnosis, develop a therapeutic plan, prescribe medication strictly for the purpose of restoring or protecting health, and re-examine that patient to determine the success or failure of the treatments. The veterinarian must also keep comprehensive records documenting these professional services. In other words, this legislation requires that there be a therapeutic purpose behind the administration of any drug and prohibits the use of drugs for purposes of promoting competition or profit. Racehorse is not a diagnosis, and a veterinarian must meet a higher standard of care in practice before administering medication. This legislation provides the essential key to returning the absolute authority over the regulation of the practice of veterinary medicine squarely back with each state veterinary board by banning all drugs during racing while reinforcing the vet board's mandate of the veterinarian client-patient relationship. In doing so, the current illusion that racing commissioners have any say whatsoever regarding which drugs a veterinarian may administer to a patient will be removed, along with any confusion about which regulatory authority is in charge. The state veterinary boards will reemerge as the effective and sole authorities and regulators over the practice of veterinary medicine in each state. This legislation not only provides a dream solution to the ethical and safety problems plaguing the United States horse racing industry, but its implementation is absolutely essential if the industry is to survive and regain its position as an international leader in the sport.
Thank you, Mr. Pacelli. You are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Terry, and thank you very much for addressing this issue. I'm glad to be on this esteemed panel. I'm representing the Humane Society of the United States, and we are an enthusiastic supporter of this legislation. You know, I think what we're talking about here is appreciation for this sport, appreciation for entertainment, but balancing it with the interests and the needs of the athletes involved, in this case both animal and human. Today's New York Times, if I can just direct you to it for a moment, a story about boxing, reconciling a sport's violent appeal as a fighter lies in a coma. So one fighter's in a coma, and we've got a front page New York Times story about it, very appropriately so. Attempts to limit the serious injury and death of fighters should be an important concern of our society. Last week, Nicholas Mavoli, participating in deep unassisted diving, died. He was trying to break the world record, if you remember. He went to 236 feet under the water without any breathing assistance, and he died. Now there's a robust debate about what some of the rules should be about that. Football. We've had an incredible discussion in society over the last 3 or 4 years about traumatic brain injuries as a consequence of professional football injuries and contact. As the son of a football coach, I pay very close attention to that issue. These football players aren't dying on the field, they're dying some years later as a consequence of this degenerative brain disorder. We heard from the official with the Anti-Doping Association about the scandals in cycling, Olympic track and field, baseball. These issues have been headlines in our nation. In horse racing, we have two problems. We have catastrophic injuries for these horses on the track, and we have widespread doping of the equine athletes. I want to say very clearly, the Humane Society of the United States does not oppose horse racing. We never have. We've been paying attention to the industry for decades. All of us are here because I think we want to see a balance between success for the industry and proper treatment of the animals and concern for the human participants, the jockeys, in this enterprise. But what we've seen over decades is an absence of adequate self-regulation, and we're presented with the question, should we do more? Should the Congress do more on this issue? And I want to say that if we're outraged about or deeply saddened by the deaths of these human athletes in other sports, we should also be outraged and saddened by the deaths of 24 horses every week on American racetracks. Every week. Not once in a while, every week. We've had drug scandal after drug scandal. You saw Dr. Rick Arthur on the video that was played during Congressman Pitts' statement. He said, quote, "It's hard to justify how many horses we go through. In humans, you never see someone snap their legs off during running in the Olympics, but you see it in horse racing." The failure for this industry to adopt comprehensive, consistent national standards is a serious problem that has been in the works decade after decade. This Congress has an opportunity now, with the massing of evidence, to do something constructive that is not going to be against the industry's interests. It's going to be in the interests of the industry. Any sport that is taking shortcuts and that is allowing routine doping and that sees this level of injury and death in the animal athletes has a major public relations problem. The sport is in decline in the United States. Other horse racing jurisdictions around the world are in their ascendancy, and they are running horses on hay, oats, and water. And when an animal is injured or ill, you address it with a palliative and allow the animal to rest and to heal, not to get on the track and to be running at 40 miles an hour or 45 miles an hour, often on unforgiving surfaces, often before they're old enough to sustain these injuries and this beating of their hooves on the track. I've got a lot of incidents in my testimony, but I want to just wrap up, Chairman Terry, by saying just a couple of quick things. This Congress has addressed issues like animal fighting at the federal level. You've done so in spite of the fact that the states have prohibitions on dogfighting and cockfighting, because there are circumstances and cases where we need federal intervention. The nature of the animal fighting enterprise is national or international. You also just conducted a hearing on the soring of Tennessee walking horses. A federal law was adopted 40 years ago because of the intentional injuring of horses by physical and chemical means to enhance performance of these horses. This Congress has jurisdiction on this issue. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Horses move nationally. Hundreds of millions of dollars wagered on these athletes. The name of this bill, Congressman Pitts' bill, is the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act. That's what needs to be restored. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we will proceed to the question and answers, where we get to ask questions and you get to answer them. We also have an issue with any minute the buzzer's going to go off for votes. So we'll see how far we can get with our questions. So, Mr. Overton, my first question is for you. Follow up on what Mr. Pacelli just said. There's 38 separate regulatory entities. I'm a 10th Amendment guy. I like to have states have their powers and their rights. If we can have 50 states with regulatory powers, what's the failure of 38? Is there a failure of these 38 racing commissions, and should there be a federal law? Yeah, microphone.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, definitely there is a problem in all 38, if not all 50 jurisdictions. It is not intent, it's by design. There is no enforceability between states of having regulations that are uniform. We do need uniform, and I would just like to point out that by doing it with USADA, we're not talking about a government takeover. They're an independent group, and they have demonstrated that they would have the enforceability. And one of the issues with that enforceability today, we've seen serious violations of trainers go on for years. The way they would handle it.
When was the last time there was a trainer suspended or kicked off because kicked out of the business because of a violation?
That's
you know.
There have been quite a few. There's some that have stays right now in the court system.
Okay. The other question is, do the racing jurisdictions share information? So if they have information on one trainer or barn that's shared with another as they go to the next racetrack?
Only if there's an investigation.
Okay.
We do share with RCI any rulings that come out.
Thank you. Mr. Tygart, since you're here, let's ask questions. You mentioned in the World Anti-Doping Code has been revised a number of times to keep up with the drugs and the appropriate testing for them. So how has the code been modified over time, and are there new drugs and tricks of the trade that need to be addressed, both in your jurisdiction and, as you would think, for the horse racing industry? Because one of the issues here, and I have an article here from buried somewhere in my paperwork here, about a compounding entity that specializes in changing the drug just enough that it can't be detected. So how do you keep up with those things?
Thanks for your question, Mr. Chairman. The code itself, which is the umbrella uniform policy, has been changed now 3 times. That the third version was just approved down in South Africa, where I came from, you mentioned earlier. The list of prohibited substances and methods is published every year. There's a democratic process, an expert group that provides information on what substances meet the criteria, whether it's performance enhancing or not, whether it's violates health and safety of athletes, and whether it violates the spirit of sport, and any of those.
And is that wholly applicable to the horse racing industry?
It very well could be. I mean, I think part of the process that this legislation would allow for would be that consultation process to come up with exactly what that criteria would be, and then have a democratic process every year that would then publish in advance. So our list is published every October, going into effect that following year. Listen, I think cheaters who want to win, and there's a big prize at the end to win, will go to great lengths to ensure that they're not caught by the testing system, even the best testing systems that may be in place. But what you've got here are labs where 2 of the 16 don't meet even the industry's. I'm sorry, 2 of the 16 are the only ones that meet the industry standards for uniformity. So the
2 out of 16.
2 out of 16, 12.5%. So you've got 87% that don't meet the RMTC's own ISO accreditation and laboratory operating procedures.
Well, let me stop you there because I only have 37 seconds. Mr. Hanrahan, you mentioned that there's only a small percentage that fail, but if it's true that they're not even testing for the right things, is that a reliable number for us to? % of failures?
Mr. Chairman, they're testing for known substances, and I would point out on the issue, for example, of dimorphin, which was an unknown substance. That there was some human intelligence, there was some suspicions, and samples were sent to the lab, and the lab developed the test to identify dimorphin. So the labs do work ahead to try and identify substances.
All right, thank you. Mr. McNerney, as acting ranking member, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to ask the chair to recognize Mr. Yarmouth from the great state of Kentucky, home of the Derby.
Absolutely, with unanimous consent, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to my colleague for yielding. As Mr. McNerney said, I represent the Kentucky Derby and Churchill Downs, and certainly thoroughbred breeding and horse racing is a signature industry of Kentucky. So I also represent owners, trainers, jockeys, grooms, and of course a lot of track workers, and of course a lot of horses as well. They don't get to vote usually. So I applaud all of you for your concern about protecting the health and safety of the horses and the riders, and also the integrity of the sport. I appreciate that very much, and I share all of your concerns. I do have a couple of specific concerns about this particular legislation. And Mr. Tygart, I want to start with you. It's already been established your background's not in horse racing. The organization's not in horse racing. So I'm a little bit concerned about the accountability that USADA might have if empowered under this legislation. To whom is USADA accountable now?
Well, we currently have federal appropriations, so we could, obviously be hauled up and testifying about any issues. Our legal process goes through a panel of independent arbitrators, so ultimately any decisions on a case, whether someone committed a doping violation or not, athlete or other person, trainer, et cetera, would ultimately go to independent arbitrators. Obviously, that would be public and written decision, publicly available. And of course, we're not immune from media scrutiny at every turn. So,
right, and I'm not questioning your capabilities or integrity. I'm just trying to establish this because a lot of times, in many cases in the commercial world, we have empowered independent agencies to set rules and regulations, and they are totally unaccountable, and that's a problem. So under this legislation, as you understand it, if you were given this authority, if there were questions about regulations you handed down, what would be the process through which, whether it was owners, vets, tracks, whoever would appeal those, or somebody else to review the regulations?
What we would envision is not unlike the process I described in my testimony with the World Anti-Doping Agency, where you've got some input at the governance level of people that are free of conflict of interest, similar to the way our board is set up today. I think we would be open to having, whether it's a wholly owned sub or additional board members added that have the type of experience that you heard in some of the testimony on that. They would obviously have to be free of any conflicts to ensure the independence. That's how we currently are operated. I think whether the legislation adds a piece of oversight or whether the agreements that the legislation calls for between us and the major stakeholders of the industry, and those agreements, certainly there could be spelled out some accountabilities to ensure proper financial management, proper governance, those types of things. Again, not on a case-by-case basis. You don't make policy on, let's say, a single high-profile case. During the middle of that case, you would want the process that's been agreed to prior to that particular case coming up to resolve itself, and then if there's any effort to revise, amend like we did with the WADA code, then you have that process built in.
Thank you. One of the provisions of the bill is that there is a ban on any medication on race day, and I know, Mr. Hanrahan, you have made the case that there may be a justification, particularly with regard to Lasix, to administer on race day. Could you kind of, in the minute and 14 seconds we have left, talk about that and why that may be problematic to put in the legislation, maybe counterproductive?
As I alluded to, Lasix is in fact the only race day medication that's allowed, with a couple of minor exceptions for adjuncts. As the RCI's model rule exists now, and as I'm sure you're aware, Kentucky is one of the states that follows that model rule that allows Lasix, but is only administered by state veterinarian or regular veterinarians, not issued or administered by a private veterinarian. The dosage is limited. The time that it's given is limited. So it's been a very effective model rule, and that's just symptomatic of how the model rule process works in terms of developing an industry consensus, whether it's on Lasix, whether it's banning steroids, et cetera.
And in 10 seconds, has that been successful in terms of facilitating, not necessarily enhancing performance on the horses, but protecting the horse on race day?
I would say yes, sir. It's been very effective in Kentucky and those states that have it. There was a little roughness getting it in place, but it's been very effective. And Lasix is a very effective drug in preventing bleeding in horses, and that protects the horse and in turn protects the jockeys.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And now there is about 5 minutes left with how many people not voting yet? 375. So we've probably got another 5 minutes. So gentlelady from Tennessee, Vice Chairman, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will do my best to not take all of my time and yield back so that others may get
Why don't you yield it to Joe?
into the queue. Okay, when I finish, I will yield. So, and I'll yield it to Joe. I think we can all agree we are all interested in the welfare of the animals. We're interested in the integrity of the sports, whether it's horse racing or walking horses or the steeplechase that we enjoy in Tennessee, or when I was a kid and in 4-H club, the quarter horses and the barrel racing and all of that my brother did. It's an important part of life for those of us who have grown up on farms or who live on farms or have that in our district. And so, Mr. Pacelli, I want to come to you for just a moment and ask you a little bit about your formal relationships in relation primarily to the hearing we had last week. And I would just like to know, do you all have a formal relationship with one of our witnesses last week, Mr. Irby?
A formal relationship? No, we do not.
Have you ever provided compensation to him to be in here in D.C. or provided expenses or travel for him to come into D.C. to provide testimony or to lobby us on the bill?
No, not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge. Could you confirm that and put it in
Sure.
writing and submit it to us?
I'd be happy to call your office and tell you, sure.
Okay, I'd like it in writing. And same with Ms. Benefell, to know what her formal
Sure.
relationship is with you all. That would be wonderful. I appreciate that. And Mr. Pitts, I yield the balance of my time to you.
Thank you.
Joe, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes, sir.
We'll also give you a couple minutes, and everyone else has said they're going to submit their questions for the record. So at the time Joe finishes his question, we will dismiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Mr. Hanrahan and Dr. Lyons, in my opening statement, I referred to a horse named Coronado Heights, who happened to have been trained by the nation's leading trainer by money, Todd Fletcher, and received 17 injections 1 week before he broke down. Mr. Hanrahan and Dr. Lyons, how is that putting the horse first? Please explain what could possibly be the benefit. Is this what is necessary to get a horse to the races, and how can this be justified, especially at the top of the sport? Mr. Hanrahan?
Yes, sir. I'm not a veterinarian, but I would suggest to you that veterinarians look at those horses depending on the medical condition of that horse, whether the horse had a cold, whether the horse had some lameness issue, etc., would determine how that horse was treated. I would also like to point out, I believe that horse was one of the horses included in the Aqueduct report for the Aqueduct Commission that was convened in light of a number of breakdowns. And with your permission, I'd like to quote something out of that report. And this is from the executive summary of that report.
Dr. Lyons.
And it says on page 4, pre-race medication administered to the fatally injured horses was similar to that administered to the uninjured horses that race. And one other thing, this is
I only have 2 minutes left. if you could submit that for the record. Dr. Lyons, would you comment? How is this putting the horse first? Explain the benefit, et cetera.
Thank you, Congressman Pitts, for the question. It's not putting the horse first. It's putting the interests of getting that horse over to the races over and above the horse's safety, its well-being. And I looked at that horse's records, and I am a veterinarian, and I can tell you that there was nothing therapeutic about the approach or the drugs that were used in that horse. In my opinion, that horse broke down as a direct result of the injury masking drugs that were stacked for weeks in advance before that horse raced and lost its life on the track. And I also am aware, and I'm quite sure it was with this case, that the owner of that horse had instructed that she did not want this horse to be medicated so that the injuries would be masked. And yet the veterinarian did not abide by her directive. So this is how this system has broken down so that veterinarians see themselves as having the role of accommodating racing rather than the welfare of the patient. So that did not take care of that.
Thank you. Mr. Hanrahan, the Blood Horse magazine announced you're being hired as the national HBPA CEO on 11/29/11, and at the time the article indicated that you were then a handicapper and occasional tournament player. Now, a recent survey of horse racing bettors performed by Penn, Sean, and Berland indicated that 86% of the biggest bettors avoid certain tracks and states because of concerns over medication integrity, and 79% of horse players factor in illegal drug use when handicapping races certain track. And these poll numbers are insightful because they basically say bettors at all levels, especially that most heavily invested, big bettors, believe that trainers are cheating and using drugs and adjust their betting accordingly. When you were actively wagering, did you take into account any of these considerations? If not, why not?
No, I did not. The primary thing in handicapping a race is how competitive the race will be. You look at the size of the field, the conditions of the race, and I would point out, as I'm sure many of you know, for horses running on Lasix, that is published in the racing program, and so everyone knows that.
Do you think this presents a perception problem? What if Warren Buffett thought Wall Street was rigged? Quit playing. Isn't this actually driving your sport out of business? 5 years ago, nearly $15 billion was bet on races in North America. Today, it's down to $10 billion. Sales and purses have slumped as well. Additionally, fewer owners, especially foreign, are buying racing horses in America. My time has expired. I have several questions for the record, Mr. Chairman, that I'll submit, and I have 2 statements for the record from Water Hay Oats Alliance and USPCA that I'd like to unanimous consent submit.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. McNerney for a short statement.
I just want to thank the witnesses for coming. I had heartfelt statements. I support H.R. 2012, and I will submit questions for the record.
So you've heard Mr. McNerney talk about questions for the records. Each member of this committee, and Joe Pitts, has the ability or right to send you questions. You have an obligation, because you agreed to testify, to answer those questions in a timely manner, which I will define in 2 weeks. If you could turn around your answers to any questions submitted to you within 2 weeks, we would greatly appreciate it. And at this time, I want to offer unanimous consent to put into the record an article entitled Texas Compounder Draws Industry Scrutiny, and November 20th letter, November 20th, 2013, NTRA letter. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I want to thank you all for your great testimony. Sorry we were rushed. We thought we were going to have about another full half hour to ask questions, but sometimes on getaway days, things tend to move quicker for some reason. So thank you very much for your insight and sharing your expert opinions with us today, and we are adjourned.